The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Carol Monaghan to move the motion.
Thank you, Ms Elliott. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I beg to move that this House has considered the international support for the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. The Southern Caucasus is a melting point of different cultures, religions and ethnicities. Over the centuries, these different groups have at times coexisted peacefully and at others experienced turmoil and bloodshed. In recent memory, we have seen the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 23, where an estimated 1.5 million people were killed by the forces from the Ottoman Empire. As the Soviet Union began to collapse in the late 1980s, the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian enclave within Azerbaijan, officially voted to become part of Armenia. Azerbaijan sought to suppress the separatist movement, while Armenia backed it. This led to clashes and eventually a full-scale war. Tens of thousands died and up to 1 million were displaced amid reports of ethnic cleansing and massacres committed on both sides. The most recent hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan show that conflict is never far away. Whilst they have recently negotiated a peace agreement, tensions remain high. And if there is a peace, it is certainly fragile. Just last year, a number of us gathered in Westminster Hall to raise concerns about the blockade of the Lachin Corridor, the main supply route from Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh. At the time, several members highlighted the potential for starvation and humanitarian catastrophe. The supposed Russian peacekeepers were at best observers and at worst actively supporting the ongoing persecution of the local Armenian population. Sadly, the outcome we most feared was realised last September when, after a 9-month blockade, the Azeri military expelled the Armenian population. This forced displacement of a people has taken place when the eyes of the world are turned elsewhere. As Armenia is a small country with a population of 3 million people, the arrival of over 100,000 refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as a further 40,000 refugees from the war in 2020, has had a significant impact on the country. I was a member of an IPU delegation that visited Armenia last month, and we met with a group of refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. They described the events of the blockade and their eventual expulsion in harrowing detail. They described the so-called Russian peacekeepers travelling to Armenia, a privilege not afforded to the local population, where they bought goods and supplies only to resell them to the starving people at massively inflated prices. They described the difficulty in acquiring medical supplies, fuel and even water. They described the violent end of the blockade when the people were shelled out of their homes. We heard how the shelling started at 12:30 midday, when children were at school and separated from their parents. They described the chaos of people trying to locate their loved ones and people abandoning their homes with just the clothes on their backs. The lucky ones had some fuel in their vehicles, the others just walked. The 40-kilometre journey to Armenia took 3 days because of Azeri forces' continued bombardment and because of obstructive bureaucracy by the Azeris at the border. The lack of water on the journey meant that many, especially the elderly, did not make it. Many of the refugees are now staying with family members in border towns and in and around Yarmouk. But every Armenian town has been impacted by the influx of refugees. The refugees are, of course, critical of Azerbaijan, but they are also critical of the Russian peacekeepers' failure to protect them. A number of officials we met believe that the Russian forces had been directed by Moscow to foster instability, not peace. And this seems to be substantiated by Kremlin rhetoric. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has insisted that Russia does not bear blame and said there was no direct reason for the exodus, merely that people are willing to leave. As an aside, non-intervention by Russian peacekeepers sets a dangerous precedent that international humanitarian law can be breached without repercussions and opens up the risk of future Azerbaijani incursions into Armenia, for example, to secure a path to its exclave of Nakhchivan. When we met with the Mayor of Yarmouk near the border, he described the triaging that had taken place and the intensive support needed, both practical and psychological, for these broken people. The UNHCR have confirmed this, noting that the 100,000 refugees required critical support. For many, this ethnic cleansing of a people has echoes of the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 23. And it's notable that while 34 countries, including the USA, Canada and France, have recognised this historic genocide, the UK has failed to do so. And I know a number of honourable members have previously raised this, including the honourable member for East Worthing and Shoreham. But in denying formal acknowledgement of this historic atrocity, the UK government continues to delegitimise the collective pain endured by the Armenian community. A Foreign Office memo from 1999 is revealing as to the motivations behind the UK's position. It reads, "Given the importance of our relationship, political, strategic and commercial, with Turkey, recognising the genocide would provide no practical benefit to the UK." So I would appreciate a response from the Minister on whether the failure to recognise this historic genocide is simply an attempt to appease a trading partner. But returning to the situation on the ground in Armenia, in October 2023, UNHCR launched a $97 million emergency refugee response plan to provide urgent humanitarian aid and protection to the refugees and those hosting them in Armenia. This support runs out at the end of this month, but not one refugee has been able to return home. And whilst there has been international support, for which the Armenian government is grateful, far more is required. The US has committed $28 million since 2020, the EU €17.5 million since September. France has committed €27.5 million in 2023, and the UK to date has committed £1 million to this. Absolutely.
The Honourable gave an excellent speech and actually outlining the scale of the crisis for Armenians who've left Nagorno-Karabakh and are now refugees. Don't you agree with me that £1 million is woefully insufficient to support the Armenian government in helping those refugees, and we need to hugely scale up our support?
I thank him for his intervention. I think it's important that we're not critical of support that has been given. So £1 million is a good starting place. But I would agree with him and ask the Minister what further financial and humanitarian support the UK will provide for the Armenian government to support the refugees and the hosts in Armenia. But aside from providing aid, the UK government has a moral responsibility to show leadership in this region. It must undertake all diplomatic efforts to foster dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan and help create the conditions for true, sustainable peace, which will allow these displaced Armenians to return home. The UK government argued in October 2023 that it was vital that international humanitarian organisations have independent access, and it welcomed Azerbaijan's decision to allow UN agencies into Nagorno-Karabakh to complement ongoing efforts by the International Committee of the Red Cross. However, given that the Armenian population had been ethnically cleansed a month earlier, this seems rather futile. In January, the UK government welcomed the two countries' historic joint statement of the 7th of December aimed at reaching a historic agreement and securing lasting peace for the region. However, there is little confidence that this peace agreement will be sustained. Given the events of the last 6 months, I will. Yeah.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. On that last point, you mentioned the honourable member mentioned a lack of confidence that progress towards peace will be progressed. But a couple of questions: does she welcome the bilateral agreements and discussions between Azerbaijan and Armenian leaders and foreign ministers towards that end? And second question is, can she explain why or from whom that lack of confidence is coming?
First of all, any agreement that is reached has to be welcomed. Any steps forward have to be welcomed. But in terms of who's concerned, the people we spoke to in the border towns who see Azeri incursions, who see the troops coming over the border, they're the ones that are telling us that they don't have confidence in this agreement because they're not seeing that actually been played out in real time in front of them. But given the events of the last 6 months, I was concerned to read that in November 2023, the Foreign Office officials were encouraging British business leaders to capitalise on lucrative commercial opportunities in Nagorno-Karabakh to support President Aliyev's rebuilding agenda. I mean, this is quite simply an abdication of the UK government's moral and ethical responsibilities. It's also hypocritical. How can the UK government condemn Azerbaijan's unacceptable use of force in Nagorno-Karabakh in September, and then 6 weeks later encourage British commercial involvement in the region? So can the Minister provide clarity on the reasons for encouraging British businesses to exploit this tragic situation? Despite limited attention from international media, the situation on the ground in Armenia remains critical. Urgent assistance is required for the refugees and those supporting them. When we asked the refugees about their hope for the future, they responded that they simply wished to return home. The International Court of Justice have issued an order requiring Azerbaijan to ensure that persons who have left Nagorno-Karabakh can return in a safe, unimpeded and expeditious manner, free from the use of force or intimidation. And whilst the Azeri government states that return is safe, the refugees were clear that this is impossible. They were starved, they were bombed and they were killed. So their hope to return cannot be realised, certainly not at this present time. So my final question to the Minister is this: what representations has he made to the Azeri government on the treatment of the refugees and on their safe passage back to their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh?
Can I remind members to bob, even if they have put in to speak, just so I am clear on who wants to speak in this debate. The question is that this House has considered international support for Armenian refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mrs. Can I begin by congratulating the Honourable Lady for Glasgow North West on obtaining the debate. She was a very valuable member of the delegation from the British group of the IPU, which I took to Armenia just a few weeks ago, and it's very good to see actually all the other members of the group, all of whom I suspect will wish to contribute, with the exception of Lord McInnes from another place where I'm sure he is pursuing these issues there as well. I'd like to thank the IPU for arranging the visit, Joe Perry, who accompanied us, and it's also good to see His Excellency the Ambassador here today, who has been hugely helpful. I think all of us felt that to be in Armenia at this time was extremely valuable. I have been to Armenia 5 times over the course of the last few years, although that is small compared to the number of my honourable friend from the other place, Baroness Cox, who is known as the Angel of Artsakh, for her numerous visits. But I have, on a previous occasion, been able to visit Nagorno-Karabakh, to talk to the administration at that time. I did so because I believe one of the most important things for us as members of Parliament is to hear the arguments from both sides and to see for ourselves. And I was very disappointed that the consequence of my simply going to Nagorno-Karabakh was that I was blacklisted by Azerbaijan, and I believe I still am blacklisted by Azerbaijan simply for visiting and holding those talks. Now, the Honourable Lady has described what I have to say were extremely moving meetings that we held with the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, and whatever the rights and wrongs, to listen at first hand to the suffering that they endured was a very emotional experience, and particularly some of the tales about how without any notice they were dragged from their homes and forced to march to neighbouring Armenia, which took a number of days, and not all of them made it, and some died on the way. And I would also like to pay tribute to those that we met in Jermuk, particularly the governor and the mayor, for the way in which they opened their doors and welcomed the refugees and are continuing to give them support. But 100,000 people have moved into Armenia from Nagorno-Karabakh, and that has put enormous pressure on, and so I absolutely endorse the need for us to give support to them. Now, I do want to say just a little bit about the conflict which has been raging for many years between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. It is the case that it is within the entire borders of Azerbaijan, but it was populated by Armenians. It is also true that a number of Azeris had been previously displaced. But I don't want to get into the arguments about sovereignty and the history behind it. We have a humanitarian need to support the refugees. We also heard, and we were privileged to hear from the Catholicos, His Holiness representing all Armenians, about the impact of the conflict on the priests and the churches in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is also a matter of serious concern. But this has been the cause of repeated conflicts and tension between two neighbouring countries for decades. And there does now appear to be a possibility of resolving that and reaching a peaceful settlement. We were extremely privileged to have a meeting with Prime Minister Pashinyan, who set out to us his wish to achieve a peace and the plan that he was putting forward. And one of the most remarkable things about the plan being advanced by the Prime Minister of Armenia at the moment is that it does not contain any territorial ambitions to regain control of Nagorno-Karabakh. That is subject to some criticism, as we heard from members of the opposition in Yerevan, but it is a realistic recognition that of what has happened, and now to try and attain the peaceful settlement. There are still issues to be resolved. In particular, the issue of the corridor connecting Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan. Those are both Azerbaijan territories, but the corridor will go through Armenia, and Armenia quite understandably believes that any corridor through their own land has to be controlled by Armenia, but they are open to negotiating free access to ensure that it is possible to travel easily between the two. But despite the apparent opportunity that now exists to obtain a peaceful settlement, and we heard repeatedly from Armenia their desire to do so, in the last few hours, the Prime Minister has issued a statement which says that Armenia could be at war by the end of a week, because they believe that Azerbaijan continues to have territorial ambitions, not just having taken back control of Nagorno-Karabakh, but for Armenia itself. And it is a very fragile situation. Now, the Azeris, and I met the Azerbaijan delegation to the OSCE when I was in Vienna a couple of weeks ago, because I lead the UK delegation, and they are absolutely adamant that they have no aggressive intent towards Armenia, and that this is propaganda being put out by the side of Armenia. But even whilst we were in Armenia, 4 Armenian soldiers were killed in a continuing conflict around the border, and we were also taken up to see territory which is undoubtedly Armenia. It is land part of Armenia which is still under occupation by Azerbaijan. So there are some serious issues to resolve, but I would hope that given the expressions of willingness to reach a settlement being made by both sides, now does represent an opportunity, and anything that we can do, and I'll be interested to hear the Minister's view about how we might facilitate that to take place, because there are wider strategic issues at stake. Armenia traditionally is a former Soviet country. It has a Russian military base. It has been seen to be very closely allied with Russia. But partially because of the feeling in Armenia that they received no support from Russia whatsoever when they were under attack, there is a real anger and a wish to break away and actually move closer to the West. And that was something else that we heard whilst we were there. And Prime Minister Pashinyan has been quite courageous in already making clear the willingness of Armenia to leave the Comprehensive Security Treaty Organization of Russia and its former satellites, and his ambition to move Armenia closer to the West. In some ways, this is not dissimilar to the decisions taken in Ukraine 10 years ago, when they too decided that their destiny lay not with Russia, but with the West and with the EU. And in the same way that we supported Ukraine in their ambition, I think we should be supporting Armenia in that ambition too. And I came back from Armenia in some ways very encouraged that that was their clear decision, that they saw their future lying with closer relations with this country. But at the same time, there is a very dangerous situation which still pertains between the two neighbours, and anything that we can do to resolve it. And as I say, I think the opportunity is perhaps greater now than it's been for many years, but I hope that we will also be working hard to achieve that.
Dr. Rupa Hook.
Thank you, Ms. Elliott. It's a pleasure to serve on your committee. And while this debate's title is primarily concerned with Armenian refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, it is a complex situation here, complex region, multiple factors at play, with some 4,400 square feet. So the refugee crisis results from, whether we're calling it annexation or occupation, a struggle that struggles at the moment, it's been said, to gain attention in a world where we're becoming increasingly desensitized to conflict, be it Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. Yet we're talking here of a European near neighbour, a democracy, with hostile neighbouring territory of Azerbaijan and its aggressions, its ethnically motivated crimes against Armenians. The figures are grim. 10 months of illegal blockade of food, fuel, electricity, forced displacement of 100,000 people. My interest in this comes from my constituency. We have a vibrant and sizable Armenian community. Many are hyphenated Armenians, Iranian Armenians, Syrian Armenians, Turkish Armenians. And that underscores the fact that this is a country that has had pogroms and massacres, genocides for many, many years. I was also one that was on the delegation in February with other MPs. That visit took in the Prime Minister, the President of the very handsome wood-panelled National Assembly, opposition and government people. In fact, a Minister for Economy we saw then had to resign hours after our visit. But look, it was only when we got out of the embassies, the ministries, when we got out to Jermuk, in the snow-capped hills there, that the most memorable aspect of the visit took place. We got out to the cosy confines of Yerevan, the capital. And we took in the ancient monastery on our route in the mountains, which is a sign that this is the cradle of Christendom. And some of the atrocities we've seen, the destruction of churches, of crosses, the attempt to entirely delete Armenian culture, the renaming of these towns and cities, sickening. Our visit also, as the member for Malden pointed out, was underscored by the killing of 4 soldiers. So it's the refugees that we saw that, as I say, were the most memorable. So Jarmuk is a town known as a bottled water brand with a reindeer as its logo, in fact. It was once a fashionable ski resort and spa town. Now it's 80% deserted from that former trade. Instead, it's readjusting to its new existence, accommodating the influx of Nagorno-Karabakh refugees. And we heard really moving, harrowing stories of human suffering, really touching stuff about people who fled on foot in the absence of fuel, the days and days it took to get over the border, the sadistic actions of the Russian soldiers with their black market, boiling sweets and all sorts of stuff, really horrific stuff, making their journey over. We spoke to the mayor and the governor of Jarmuk, and as I say, the trauma that has beset these people, different generations, they've integrated well. They were grateful for what the municipality is doing. But, you know, our voice should be stronger in this country because we were in this room in 2020 debating the blockade of the Lachin corridor, and just a weakened response emboldens, and this thing was totally foreseeable all those years ago. And it's been pointed out that, you know, this is an old elite that moved from a velvet revolution. It's turning away from Russian influence. I think it's been called a pivot away from the Kremlin. It's not been a comfortable transition. The EU has granted candidate status to Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, no such privilege for Armenia, despite the fact, and also no love from Russia, despite the fact it's still a member of the CSTO. We vowed to use our voices to raise their plight on our return. And we laid flowers at the National Genocide Memorial. Again, the very fact there is a National Genocide Memorial, the hyphenated Armenians of Ealing and Acton remind us of how wide the Armenian diaspora is. It's scattered and forced throughout different countries because of continuous persecution, genocide and displacement. Among the 20,000 in London, we have Ukrainian Armenian communities. Ealing Borough, mine, has long commemorated the Armenian genocide of 1915, and we've had an apricot tree at Ealing Green. It was upgraded this September to a more permanent memorial, already vandalised by what is suspected to be the Turkish Wolves group, who protested its inauguration last autumn. I've called for this government to recognise 1915 as a genocide. Our closest ally, Biden, has done, but yet there's been no budging, and there's this timidity, this vacuum that allows these actions of Azerbaijan, who's recently had an election which the result was entirely foreseeable, rather like the Russian election of this weekend. So I would say Ealing and Acton are richer for having the Navastratian Centre in Northfields, the Hayashen Centre in Acton, which both have done fundraising for Nagorno-Karabakh refugees. But what is our government doing? It just feels that in our post-Brexit world, again, our desperation for trade deals, the fact that BP, I would like to ask the Minister how far oil pulls the strings in these relationships. People who did do election observation in Baku said you could smell the oil when you land. It's all about oil. And how ironic that COP29 will be held in Baku. What an act of greenwashing when we've heard at the APPG yesterday how the ground is being rendered infertile for flora and fauna, you know, this scorched earth policy and this greenwashing thing that they're doing by holding COP there. So I want to pay tribute to my Armenian communities, but also to press the government on aid. We know that the 0.7 commitment that we all stood on our manifesto to maintain has been cut. Could there be the introduction of a, say, Homes for Ukraine's type of scheme for refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. We saw the trauma, psychological help for generations of people that have undergone this recent cycle of violence. It is a cycle of violence. But ultimately, I think the people of Nagorno-Karabakh want to return to their land, places that they've lived in for millennia, even though we see these sort of attempts to wipe out territories like Artsakh from the map. So I think I'll wind up here and just say that the eyes of the world may be elsewhere, but we must not forget, we must be consistent in our principles. In Ukraine, we say that self-determination and destruction are wrong, so why can we not apply the same principles consistently here? Shnor Havor, thank you.
Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Mrs. Elliott. I congratulate Glasgow North on getting yet another debate to do with Armenia and Armenians. We've spoken a lot in this chamber and in the main chamber. My private member's bill on the recognition of the Armenian genocide, also others have followed there, and of course the debate we had on the Lachin corridor blockade, which was at the start of this recent problem we see. So can I declare an interest, both as the chair of the all-party group for Armenia and as part of a delegation that went to Armenia last Easter as an invitation of the Armenian government. And I think there's a very strong interest in this subject, Mrs. Elliott, not only in the colleagues here today, but also in an overflowing public gallery for which extra furniture has had to be provided, which doesn't happen often. We had I have to say, a very alarming and sobering briefing from the former Human Rights Ombudsman for Armenia, Dr. Tatoyan, yesterday, who gave us an up-to-date position of the latest threat facing Armenia, as well as the chronology of what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh over the last year. So I agree with everything the Honourable Lady has said. I might well friend for Morden as well, and I won't repeat what they've said, but let me just highlight the origins of all of this, because it goes back in the recent conflict to the 27th of September 2020, when Azerbaijan, emboldened by strong military support from Turkey and with equipment provided by Israel, amongst others, launched an unprovoked and large-scale military invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh. And over a period of 44 consecutive days, Azerbaijan relentlessly assaulted Nagorno-Karabakh, resulting in the tragic loss of over 400 Armenian lives. Civilian infrastructure, including churches, schools and hospitals, became deliberate targets of Azerbaijan. And there was a particular concern, as the Honourable Lady has mentioned, about some of the Christian relics and monuments, because Armenia was, of course, the first Christian country, and you don't have to go far in Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh to see the history behind that. That conflict ended in a ceasefire agreement on the 9th of November 2020 between Armenia, Azerbaijan and Russia, a trilateral statement, but heavily skewed against Armenia. Then fast forward to 2022, the end of 2022, and the blockade of the Lachin corridor, with bogus eco-protesters supposedly blockading that vital corridor between Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. Azerbaijan completely ignored all orders under international law and the International Court of Justice to clear that corridor, and instead Azerbaijani soldiers replaced the protesters. And then, of course, last September, the 19th of September, Azerbaijan launched a full-scale offensive, piling into Nagorno-Karabakh, mercilessly reoccupying territory and driving Armenians out of their homes that they've been in for generations, blockading escape routes out of the territories we heard yesterday as well, taking a number of prisoners, military prisoners, but also a number of political prisoners, specific individuals. Despite the Azerbaijani government having made assurances of amnesty, they took into captivity, and they remain in captivity, former Nagorno-Karabakh presidents Arkady Gukakisyan, Bako Sahakian, Ariek Harutyunyan, And other political POWs include Ruben Vardanyan, David Ishkanyan, David Babayan, David Makuyan, and Levon Manakkanyan. Hence, we're relieved to know I provide details of those individuals later. Now, what was the result of all of that? Well, frankly, Ms. Elliott, full-scale ethnic cleansing. The population of Nagorno-Karabakh used to be 160,000 before the 2020 war. However, when women, elderly and sick people were evacuated during the initial bombings, many never went back after the ceasefire in November 2020. The very sick and some students left Nagorno-Karabakh during the blockade, and it's estimated that most recently 105,000 Armenians left Nagorno-Karabakh after the attacks in September 2023 in a state of chaos, blocked roads which took hours and days to negotiate. And it's calculated that Nagorno-Karabakh is almost completely empty of its original population, with just 50 people remaining. Armenian sources report that those who have remained are due to age or physical, mental conditions, are even unable to use their mobile phones. Now, that huge surge of people into Armenia has had an impact on the population of Armenia. Not a large country, 2.8 million population. So just over 100,000 represents 3% of that country's population, all of a sudden appearing on its doorsteps. A country which lacks funds and a long-term plan as well. So it's been a really difficult set of circumstances for them to cope with. The Armenian government have generously given one-off payments of $250 to the refugees, followed by $185 monthly stipends. But the minimum wage in Armenia is, on average, they earn $668 per month. A quarter of the Nagorno-Karabakhans were already living below the official poverty line. Now, the Honourable Lady mentioned that there have been pledges of support from the EU, but big delay in the disbursement of those funds, and other countries as well. But the UK has only so far pledged £1 million. A good start, but I'm afraid doesn't really reflect the scale of the humanitarian crisis, which has gone so under the radar because the world's attention, as we know, is on what's going on in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza as well. Those new arrivals from Nagorno-Karabakh include 30,000 children and 18,000 over the age of 65. Many men with limbs missing from war injuries and landmine explosions from the conflict. So this is a population in an above-average need of help and support as well. And what has Azerbaijan done? Azerbaijan is completely trying to remodel, rename, and reculturalize, if that's such a word, the entire territory. In October last year, Azerbaijan renamed one of the streets in the city of Stepanakert after Enver Pasha, one of the architects of the Armenian genocide. What more hostile, provocative act could you think of? In March, just a few days ago, footage was aired on Azerbaijan television of various buildings and monuments in Stepanakert, the capital, including its historic parliament building, being demolished for no good reason. And there are more than 4,000 Armenian historical and cultural monuments across Nagorno-Karabakh, among them churches, kakars, burial grounds, historical cemeteries, bridges. And there's a very real concern about the future of the culture of Armenians, that what's left behind in Nagorno-Karabakh that couldn't be taken out of the country. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
We were in Djibouti, we saw two kakar, I think it's called, the crosses that had been with the post that had been removed from Nagorno-Karabakh. They were in pieces, but they were hoping to be destroyed. But they said there were many thousands that just couldn't be taken with them. So that's a whole. The ones we saw were over 1,000 years old. There'd be many others left behind. This is real cultural destruction.
It is completely gratuitous, unnecessary cultural destruction. It's all about trying to erase the name, the culture, the history, the heritage of a peoples who have lived in that territory for many, many generations. And of course, we saw after the 2020 invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh, the government of Azerbaijan blatantly issued a set of postage stamps which pictured a man in a hazmat suit effectively cleaning out the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh of our Armenian. This is ethnic cleansing in any shape or form that you want to describe it. So in conclusion, Mrs. Elliott, I think our asks of the Minister here today, notwithstanding our long-standing and important economic links with Azerbaijan, we also have humanitarian responsibilities and a long-standing relationship with Armenia and Armenians as well, and the Armenian diaspora across the world and in the United Kingdom. Will the government investigate whether ethnic cleansing under the UN definitions has actually taken place, and if so, what are the implications of that? Will the government press for the investigation of both politically and military prisoners who are still being held by the Azeris? And what is the government going to do to put pressure on the Armenians, on the Azerbaijanis, to withdraw from the 4,400 square kilometre territory within sovereign Armenian boundaries, which they are still occupying, some 30 or so villages, and where, as we've heard already, there is great alarm that they may make further military encroachments deeper into clear sovereign Armenian territory in the very near future. There need to be consequences of these abuses of international law. There need to be sanctions. I think the UK has a role to play in any peacekeeping force that could go back into making Nagorno-Karabakh and the borders of Armenia safe, because this is a very fragile situation, Mrs. Elliott. And I think we have a duty of care here, and I think one of those duties of this House is to make the world aware of the ethnic cleansing, the huge humanitarian crisis that has been going on beneath the world's radar whilst its attention is turned elsewhere. But that makes it no less serious, a humanitarian crisis going on as we speak.
Jessica Morden.
Ms Elliott, and thanks also to the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West for securing what was a very important debate and her clear and excellent speech setting out the plight to the refugees for Nagorno-Karabakh. And it is obviously timely given the return of the IPU delegation to Yerevan, which I think all of us have turned up to the debate today. And our thanks to the IPU and to Joe Perry and our leader there, the Honourable Member for Malden, for the organisation of that. And it's also timely because of the uncertainty about the continuation of the UN aid, which the Honourable Member spoke of earlier. It was poignant for me to visit 2 years on from the previous delegation, where we were warned many times and in stark terms that whilst the eyes of the world were elsewhere, Azerbaijan would take control of Nagorno-Karabakh and Russia would stand by. And that's, I know, members of the APBG who declare an interest on that visit, raised questions, raised debates, went to see the Minister, and I remember a particularly feisty speech by the Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham on that. And that's exactly what happened following the 9-month blockade, designed to drive the ethnic Armenian population out in a brutal way, which the European Parliament has described as ethnic cleansing, which is why now we should heed the warnings from those we met in Yerevan just a few weeks ago, who told us the risk of escalation is ever present. In fact, 4 Armenian soldiers were killed during our visit there. The encroachment on the 30 villages, which the Honourable Member referred to, the incidents on the borders, the fear that Azerbaijan could use military force to impose the Zangezur transport corridor, supported by Russia, with references to Armenia as Western Azerbaijan. It is a fragile ceasefire, and I hope the Minister today will acknowledge that fear and do all he can with the levers he has and with the relationship he has with Azerbaijan to be a friend to Armenia. The subject of today's debate is rightly the fate of those driven from their homes, most of whom have ended up in Armenia, although some in Russia and Europe. We talk of the 100,000 plus refugees, almost the entire population, as others have said, but we should also remember the 40,000 displaced in the 2020 conflict. 1 in 30 of Armenia's population is now from Nagorno-Karabakh, and although the government has tried to be generous with the payments, which have been referred to by the Honourable Member, housing, psychological support, employment, it is an enormous number to integrate, and we'll need a long-term plan for those exposed and facing an uncertain future. And like other honourable members, we will never forget those refugees we met in Jamuk, and we promised with them to give a voice to them, and we are doing so today. They were subjected to a 9-month blockade, lacking food, medicine, energy, fuel, surrounded and very isolated. We heard of those killed, those injured by shrapnel, those forced to walk the 3 days to Armenia as fuel was only sold at inflated prices if they could get it, those who died on the walk, the mothers who boiled their sweets to get sugar into their children, and the reports of the Russian peacekeepers who sold food at inflated prices, exploiting human misery. And their arrival with absolutely nothing but the scars that they carried from that blockade, too fearful ever to return home if ever they could. We saw on our visit the generosity led by the Mayor and the Governor of the local authorities and the local communities who are trying to help, but the magnitude of the problem is beyond what Armenia can cope with. International aid and humanitarian aid has come, but more will be needed. 60 international and local organisations have helped. Armenia has taken out a loan from the World Bank, and the diaspora, including the community in South Wales, and I thank them for that, has helped, but longer-term integration will take more, with housing and employment a priority. Resolving humanitarian issues must be prioritised alongside diplomatic negotiations, so it would be good to hear from the Minister today what more the UK government can do to address the plight of the refugees with international partners right now to address the scale of the problem. And we've talked about the £1 million in aid and how that should be increased. What the Minister knows about the UNHCR response plan, which sets out relief efforts until the end of this month, what happens next. And more generally, what conversations is the government having with the government of Azerbaijan regarding the right to return for those who are displaced, with the Armenians freezing membership of the CSTO and significantly rebalancing its international relations? What practical steps is the UK taking to embrace Armenia's pivot to the West? And can I also join other honourable members in asking ministers about reports the government encouraged businesses to get involved in the building of Nagorno-Karabakh, exploiting what is a horrific situation. With Armenia's reliance on its neighbour for trade, energy and grain, what more can this government do to build on the strength of, I know the Minister has been twice in recent times, build on the strength of those ministerial visits and the strategic partnerships to cooperate on things like energy projects, infrastructure, transport, defence? May I also raise the issue of acknowledging the genocide in 1915? I would point out in Cardiff we have the first genocide memorial in the UK, which many of us join members of the community in their commemorations there, and also join other honourable members in their points about the destruction of the cultural sites and the cultural artefacts, particularly the caja that we saw, I hope I said that right, that we saw when we visited the Catholicos, and as the honourable members have said, we saw just 2, and they were absolutely beautiful and ancient, but we were told that there were thousands more destroyed. It's a very good turnout for this debate today, not least in the very busy public gallery. So please, will the Minister take that and acknowledge that we in this Parliament care about the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh and care about Armenia and want our government to actively help strengthen the relationship and be a friend to Armenia. And as the Honourable Member for Ealing said so well earlier on, our voice in this place should be stronger.
Backbenchers left, if you can bear that in mind when you were speaking. David Ducat.
Thank you very much. And I will try and make my comments within that time. I'd like to start by drawing the House's attention to my entry in the register of members' financial interests, including my role as an officer in the all-party parliamentary group for Azerbaijan. And also my wife is from Azerbaijan, and to all my family and friends there who might be watching, I'd like to wish them a very happy Novruz for tomorrow. The history of the Karabakh region is a long and complicated one, as other honourable and right honourable members have already said. It actually predates the formation of the Soviet Union, but for most observers and commentators, and for the purposes of today's debate, the history since the fall of the the Soviet Union is most relevant. However, the stated history of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, including in today's debate, doesn't always go right back to the start of recent hostilities that predated the fall of the Soviet Union. Separatist demonstrations, confrontations and skirmishes, as well as failed interventions by the Soviet leadership, took place at various times between 1988 and 1991. And during this time, Azerbaijanis living in Armenia were also forced to flee that country. But the conflict did escalate into all-out war after Armenia and Azerbaijan attained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. And often when the history of this period is presented, it only goes back to when Armenian-backed forces were already in full occupation of the region, even though internationally recognised as the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan. But what is not often reported, and it hasn't been mentioned by speakers today, at least not yet, as a result of the occupation of Azerbaijan's Karabakh region, over 800,000 ethnic Azerbaijanis from that region also became displaced from those territories. In 1994, jumping ahead, a ceasefire was reached through Russian mediation, but skirmishes continued along what became known as the line of contact. And during that time of ceasefire, there were a number of international resolutions, including in January 2005, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, PACE, condemned ethnic cleansing against Azerbaijanis. In May 2007, the Council of Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the Organisation of Islamic Conference, the OIC, adopted a resolution considering the occupation of Azerbaijani territory as the aggression of Armenia against Azerbaijan and recognising the actions against Azerbaijani civilians as a crime against humanity. I'm quoting this, by the way. And condemning the destruction of archaeological, cultural and religious monuments in those occupied territories. In March 2008, an OIC resolution further condemned the occupation of Azerbaijani lands by Armenian forces and Armenian aggression against Azerbaijan, ethnic cleansing against the Azeri population, etc. Also in March 2008, the United Nations General Assembly adopted resolution number 62/243, which demanded that immediate, complete and unconditional withdrawal of all Armenian forces from all occupied territories of the Republic of Azerbaijan. And finally, this is not by any means an exhaustive list of resolutions. In May 2010, the European Parliament in Strasbourg adopted the resolution that the occupied Azerbaijani regions around Nagorno-Karabakh must be cleared as soon as possible. In September 2020, a new war erupted in Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding territories, in response to which the United Nations called on both sides to de-escalate tensions and resume meaningful negotiations. This war ended in November 2020, when a trilateral ceasefire agreement was signed between Azerbaijan, Armenia and Russia, according to which Azerbaijan regained all the occupied territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as one-third of Nagorno-Karabakh proper, including Shusha and Hadrut. Unfortunately, an identifying feature of this conflict has been the extensive use of landmines throughout the area, particularly along the contact line, as well as in the form of booby traps that have been left behind by departing Armenian occupying forces. According to the Azerbaijan National Agency for Mine Action, ANAMA, through a survey which is still ongoing, over 1 million hectares of land in this area could be contaminated by, according to initial estimates, approximately 1.5 million landmines. From 1991 until the ceasefire in 2020, over 3,000, I think it was almost 3,500 people were injured or killed by landmines. But even since that ceasefire in 2020, a further 346, as of the 5th of March, had been added to that number. And with landmine contamination accounting for some 12% of Azerbaijan territories, coupled with a reported lack of reliable maps provided by Armenia, the threats emanating from the mines will continue disrupting the life and economic well-being of Azerbaijani displaced persons for decades to come. I welcome the assistance that the United Kingdom government has given, up to now, not just to the specific mine-clearing efforts in Azerbaijan, but also towards the valuable lessons being learned in that operation that will be invaluable, that will no doubt prove invaluable in other areas of conflict where landmines are being used. Others have discussed the events of 2022 to 2023, which culminated in the return of occupied territories to Azerbaijan. At this time, there was also an exodus of over 100,000 ethnic Armenians from the area, mostly to Armenia itself, which is the core subject of this debate. And there is no doubt that the conflict itself and the return of occupied territories to Azerbaijan must have been distressing and destabilising for the people living in Karabakh. And the desire to flee may, in some way, in some way understandably, particularly given some of the propaganda and fear-mongering that may have taken place with regards to the intentions of Azerbaijani authorities. However, Azerbaijan refutes any accusation of ethnic Armenians being forcibly removed. Various UN missions, including experts from UNICEF, OCHA, World Health Organization, UNHCR, visited the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan twice on October 23, did not come across any reports of mistreatment with respect to ethnic Armenians or civilian infrastructure, including cultural objects. Similarly, the UNHCR and Red Cross, personally present on the ground throughout, have not.
You and I were sharing the time.
And we have one more speaker.
No.
Yes, between two people. Between two people.
All right, I apologise. I misheard.
Thank you.
I'll skip ahead to my conclusions in that case.
Sure. Take the whole 9.5.
Azerbaijani authorities have repeatedly and unambiguously confirmed their commitment to create conditions for Armenians to stay and to reintegrate and to ensure the right to return for those Armenians who can apply for Azerbaijani citizenship. The return should, of course, be respectful of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. As Azerbaijan sees it, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is over. With the exception of a few local incidents, the last 5 months have been the calmest period in the history of the former conflict, going back to the late 80s. Azerbaijan and Armenia have never been this close to peace since they were neighbouring Soviet republics. On 7th December 2023, I won't repeat the full extent of what's been done, but as part of the confidence-building measures, Armenia has supported Azerbaijan's bid to host COP29, while Azerbaijan supports Armenia's candidacy for COP Bureau membership. Both sides have also been working continuously on the draft peace agreement through the last 5 months. Azerbaijani and Armenian foreign ministers, as I mentioned earlier, have met, as have their countries' respective leaders. All of these meetings have appeared to be positive and constructive, and I'd welcome the Minister's comments on how he and the UK Government view the progression of those talks. As Azerbaijan and Armenia engage in these direct negotiations to reach sustainable peace, it's very important that the progress of these negotiations, and therefore the future of the whole region, is not undermined by domestic or international political interference.
First of all, can I commend the Honourable Lady for Glasgow North West for setting the scene? I thought she set the scene very, very well. Spoke of the issues of the refugees, 100,000 refugees. So let's focus on the issues of what this debate is about. It's about the refugees. It's about the fact that they have been abused. They've been attacked. They've had their property stolen. They've had health issues, they've had education. Their whole way of life has changed because of the aggression of the Azerbaijanis. So that's quite clear what has happened, and beyond no illusions. I remember the Honourable Member Stephen Pound. He was a member in this House. He was a friend of Armenia, and he told me many times about the stories that related to that. There's absolutely no doubt that Russians' aggression against Armenia has had its detrimental effect upon good people who have been abused and as a result of that. But I want to speak about, as the party's health spokesperson, but the party's spokesperson on human rights as well. It's been suffered by minorities, and refugee flows, internal displacement has been demonstrated time and time again. The link between minorities and refugees was also recognised in a resolution of the Commission on Human Rights in 2001 concerning persons belonging to national, ethnic, religious or linguistic minorities. So I'm going to speak very quickly, Madam Chair, with your agreement on the issue of religious belief and ethnic minorities, because that's what I do in this House. And as a chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, I'm going to say that very quickly. I know the people in this audience here today, in this gallery just behind us. I don't know any of them, by the way, just say that quite clearly. But I'm sure that some of those people have been disenfranchised for their ethnic beliefs, for their religious persuasion that they have. So religious minorities as refugees face greater chances of human rights abuses and discrimination across the whole of the world. Human rights and freedom of religious belief, they march hand in hand together. You take away one, you take away the other, and that's how it works. As the conflict continues, the religious rights and actions for and against religious minority refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh must be addressed. So I'm hoping that the Minister, and two shadows I know will do it, I'm hoping the Minister will, when I sum it up, also take on board that issue. In addition to refugee rights and forward, the UK must maintain relations and monitoring of the rights of freedom of religious belief within Armenia during this conflict, as they have lost so much. I make a quick example of one. I'm aware of that on the 7th of February, Yerevan's Criminal Court of Appeal rejected a 20-year-old Baptist conscientious objector, David Nazaretian, appeal against a 2-year jail term imposed in October 2023 for refusing military service. Now, I'm a Baptist as well, and I understand why I want to see for Baptist religious groups, but also other groups as well. Nazarbayevan's application for return of civilian service was repeatedly denied. He has considered a further appeal and will not be required to go to jail until any further appeal is heard. The last known jailed conscientious objector was freed in 2001. Last comment, Madam Chair, and I give you my word in this. I'll certainly not be taking 8 minutes to put over my point of view. As reported by Freedom House, Article 18 of the Constitution recognises the Armenian Apostolic Church as a national church responsible for the preservation of Armenian national identity. 94% of the population identifies as Armenian apostolic. Members of religious minority groups have reported some discrimination in the past. In 2020, the National Security Service opened an investigation into Yazidi activist Sasik Sultanyan after he publicly stated that Yazidis experienced discrimination in both areas. International human rights NGOs criticised the investigation as brutality and unlawful. The case was apparently ongoing. I just say this in conclusion, Madam Chair. As someone who takes a deep interest in human rights issues and freedom of religious belief, on behalf of all these people in this gallery and all those 100,000 who have been disenfranchised and discriminated against, I think it's time that we stood up for those people and did the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Lowe.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mrs Elliott, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North West, for securing this debate this afternoon. This is a debate that's long overdue, and it's over a year since we debated the closure of the Lachin corridor and the impact of Azerbaijan's aggressive actions towards the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, also known as Artsakh. In January 2023, the majority of those who spoke recognised the dire humanitarian situation emerging in the region. We understood the tactics being employed by Azerbaijan, and we warned that without a sufficient response from the international community, there would be a full-scale ethnic cleansing, and that's exactly what happened. Indeed, Chair, as I mentioned in my speech at the time, the President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, made his desired outcome of the blockade clear when he said, and I quote, "Whoever doesn't want to become our citizens can leave. The road is open. They can go by the cars of Russian peacekeepers, by buses. No one will impede them." Well, what a welcome that is. He wanted to force the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh to leave their ancestral homeland. 9 months after that debate, we saw those words put into action. After Azerbaijan violated the 2020 ceasefire agreement by launching a full-scale military offensive in Nagorno-Karabakh on the 9th of September, over 100,000 Armenians, almost all of the region's ethnic Armenian population, fled in fear of persecution. This in addition to the 40,000 who had already fled in 2020. The Lachin corridor, which has been blockaded for so long, became the only escape route for those people, fleeing on foot, by car or by truck, by carriage or tractor, by any means necessary. They left behind their homes and belongings, their churches and cemeteries, and their businesses and their schools. They were forcibly displaced from their land and became refugees. A group of more than a dozen non-governmental organisations, including Genocide Watch, have issued a warning that all the conditions for ethnic cleansing are now in place. So what assessment has the UK government made of this claim, and will the Minister commit to supporting an independent fact-finding mission to establish what has occurred in Nagorno-Karabakh and to support and promote justice for the victims in the coming months? Furthermore, what conversations is he having with Azerbaijani colleagues regarding the right of return of those who fled Nagorno-Karabakh, and what guarantees for the safety of those displaced would Azerbaijan be willing to provide in line with the International Court of Justice order? Armenia is now facing an extensive refugee crisis with a population, as already suggested, of 3 million. 1 in 30 people in Armenia is now a refugee. For most of the refugee population, they arrive in Armenia suffering from acute effects of the blockade, with medical workers reporting a high number of cases of malnourishment, dehydration, and a lack of access to prescriptions. Armenia has been generous in providing resources to host refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, but the aid has been straining the state budget, and it's now not clear how long the Armenian government can sustain the payments. It is a huge burden for a country of some 3 million people, a quarter of whom who already live below the official poverty line. In October last year, the UNHCR estimated the Armenian government would need $97 million to cover refugees' essential needs through the end of March, and the Armenian government has sought international aid, but the amounts received have been insufficient. France, the EU and the US have led the way in providing support. France has given €27.5 million in financial support, alongside delivery of humanitarian aid containing 5 tonnes of medical equipment for the treatment of severely injured persons forcibly displaced. The EU has also given $17 million, while the US has provided $11.5 million to address healthcare and other emergency needs. The UK, meanwhile, has only offered $1 million, which is welcome, and it is a start to the International Committee of the Red Cross to meet humanitarian needs. However, this is not enough. More aid is needed to immediately tackle the ongoing refugee crisis caused by this mass displacement. So will the Minister commit today to providing more financial assistance? While this aid is much needed, it only addresses the symptoms and not the cause of the crisis. Support and protection is not just required for Armenian refugees, but for Armenian human rights and ultimately for Armenian sovereignty. Chair, atrocities do not begin when the first family are expelled from their home or when the first village is razed to the ground. Wars do not begin when the first shot or missile is fired or when the first troops and tanks cross the border. More often than not, they begin with words. They begin with othering and dehumanising a group of people. They begin by rewriting history, as we've heard from the member for Banff and Buchan. They begin by laying claim to other people's territory. So let us hear some of the words of the President of Azerbaijan in recent years. Earlier last decade, he tweeted, "Armenia as a country is of no value. It is actually a colony, an outpost run from abroad, a territory artificially created on ancient Azerbaijani lands." On October in 2020, during the war, he made public address in Azerbaijan in which he said regarding the progress of the war, and I quote, "We are driving them away like dogs." And a couple of years ago, he encouraged Azerbaijani media to refer to Armenian settlements by Azerbaijani names, and has encouraged the use of the term Western Azerbaijan instead of Armenia. All of this is historically incorrect and is hate speech. These words are being put into practice. In the Nakhchivan exclave of Azerbaijan, all Armenian cultural heritage has been destroyed, most notably the cemetery of Jofa, where thousands of centuries-old monuments were destroyed to make way for a military shooting ground. Shocking, is it not? From Google Earth satellite view of the site, an Azerbaijan slogan on the side of a hillside has been carved saying, "Everything is for a homeland," where the cemetery used to reside. Will Armenian culture heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh suffer the same fate? There are more than 4,000 Armenian historical and cultural monuments that are under the threat of total destruction. So can the Minister assure me of the steps the UK Government is taking to preserve this cultural heritage? Shamefully, the UK Government has also been caught encouraging UK businesses to participate in Aliyev's plans for Nagorno-Karabakh. Was senior UK Government official encouraging business leaders to take advantage of the financial opportunities, in which he said, and I quote, "huge western chunk of the country that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up." So therefore, why is the UK Government not willing to condemn Azerbaijan's actions towards Armenia, but instead willing to be complicit and participate in these actions? Why, when the first prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued an expert opinion explaining that Azerbaijan's impeding of food, medical supplies and other essentials in Nagorno-Karabakh represented, and I quote, "the archetype of genocide through the imposition of conditions of life designed to bring about a group's destruction," when the ICJ considered it, and I quote, "plausible that the Lachin corridor blockade had produced a real and imminent risk to the health and life of the Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh, did the UK not take provisions to prevent this?" The renewed conflict demonstrates the failure of years of diplomatic efforts to prevent the persecution of ethnic Armenians. The lack of any condemnation, of sanctions for wrongdoing, of action to ensure a sustainable peace will only be taken as a green light for further acts of aggression. Indeed, in Sunik province, illegal incursions have been made on Armenian sovereign territories, with the establishment of armed outposts, blocking roads, denying access to fields, places of work and places of worship, and intimidating and threatening civilians. Azerbaijan continues to make territorial demands on Armenia and has ambitions to create a Zangezur corridor connecting Azerbaijan with its Nakhchivan exclave and to Turkey, cutting off Armenia's southern border with Iran. Any land grab from Azerbaijan is illegal under international law, and the UK has a duty to take a stand on this. Will the Minister make it crystal clear today that this is unacceptable? Chair, these are the next steps in creating what President Aliyev calls Western Azerbaijan, and it's quite simply akin to the Putin playbook in Ukraine being repeated by Aliyev in Armenia. We cannot and must not embolden this behaviour. Throughout the world, the rules-based system is under threat by the actions of leaders who believe they can act with impunity. The flouting of international law is becoming more commonplace and it's getting closer and closer to home. Whether it's Russia, Israel or Azerbaijan, the UK cannot pick and choose when human rights protections and international law applies, depending on who it's allies with. If the UK is to play a credible role in the world, it must be consistent. In this instance, it must support the rights of Armenian refugees and the Armenian people. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Ms Elliott, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship today, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West for securing this crucial debate. And we've heard typically powerful speeches from across the House, including my colleagues from Newport East and Ealing Central and Acton, East Worthing and Shore and Malden, and a typically powerful speech from my honourable friend from Strangford. And with such an unsettled global landscape, we must be absolutely clear not to lose sight of enduring geopolitical hotspots with the potential to lead to not only further human suffering, but also risk escalation in wider tensions. And tensions in the Caucasus are a key example of this, and I'm pleased that we're able to debate these today. And, Chair, the situation in the region remains very serious. I remain in regular contact with both the Armenian and the Azerbaijani ambassadors to the UK, and indeed I've met the foreign ministers of both Azerbaijan and Armenia in recent times. We all want to see peace and stability in the region, and indeed any return to the full-scale conflict of recent years. That would be an absolute disaster for the region and indeed for all peoples. But it's fair to say, and we've heard this today, Madam Chair, that this has been a profoundly challenging years for the people in the region and indeed more broadly. Last September, as has been heard, we saw Azerbaijan launch a military incursion into Nagorno-Karabakh, which at the time was home to the ethnic Armenian population of 120,000 people. This was, of course, preceded by the 9-month blockade of the Lachin corridor, leading to shortages of food, fuel, medicine and basic provisions, which completely undid the social fabric of the enclave, leaving the UK to declare a humanitarian emergency in August of 2023. This is an issue that I raised on regular occasions with the Minister and indeed publicly and in debates in this House. We saw gas supplies cut off, we saw electricity and communications damaged, and I know this was a concern to members across the House. Nagorno-Karabakh became unreachable to the world, and the implications of this period of such unimaginable insecurity and uncertainty continue, understandably, to reverberate throughout the population, now displaced with their lives altered irrevocably, and no people should have to live in such conditions. We've heard, Madam Chair, that in September last year, Nagorno-Karabakh came under direct Azeri control, and now the ethnic Armenian population has had to flee into Armenia. And although, as we've heard, the ICJ issued provisional measures in November 2023 ordering Azerbaijan to allow ethnic Armenians to return in, and I quote, a safe, unimpeded and expeditious manner, they remain in Armenia. Now, I am pleased that there have been efforts made since by both countries and indeed global interlocutors, including the EU, the United States and ourselves, to find peace, to normalise relations. The situation remains very precarious, and any further deterioration would only compound the suffering experienced by the people, especially those refugees located around Yerevan and Syunik. And I've seen from reports in recent days that, publicly at least, peace seems closer than ever, but we have to remain cognizant that, given the recent history, we have to go much further to bring tensions down to where they need to be and to ensure that both the territorial integrity of both Armenia and Azerbaijan is maintained. And we've heard powerful testimony from colleagues who went on that recent IPU visit, and we must remember that there is always often a tragic human face to conflicts and situations such as these. As Action Against Hunger highlights, Armenia is now faced with an extensive refugee crisis, with 1 in 30 people throughout the country being a refugee. More than half of those refugees are women and girls, nearly 1/3 are children, and nearly 1/5 are elderly, with their whole lives having been uprooted. There is a mental health crisis too, with nearly 22,500 of those refugees estimated to be living with a mental health condition, and it is clear that this is beyond the capacity of any one government to manage. And despite the many crises that we face globally, and we're regularly debating them in this place and indeed in the main chamber, we cannot allow these Armenian refugees to endure the challenges of 2024 without adequate support and without a clear means of beginning to rebuild the lives that they lost in September last year. And I therefore have a number of questions for the Minister, and I hope that he'll be able to provide some clarity to the House today. Firstly, will the UK Government continue to play a constructive and substantial role in brokering lasting peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and what recent discussions has he had with counterparts from both countries and indeed other interlocutors, and what were the outcomes of those discussions? What discussions has he had in particular with French and American officials on this issue, and in particular in dealing with the impacts on individuals who have been affected and displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh? How can we work together to provide provide critical support to those refugees. We simply cannot return to the violence of 2020 when more than 6,500 people lost their lives and civilians are having to live under the perpetual threat of conflict and violence. We need to work, of course, with European and regional partners to secure a return to dialogue more broadly and a peaceful settlement. I hope he can provide some further clarity on the funding issues that have been raised by a number of colleagues. In the end of September last year, of course, he and the government announced £1 million of funding for the ICRC to support their humanitarian response for those refugees. And the FCDO said in February this year that it continues to liaise with the UN, ICRC and other NGOs to assess humanitarian needs in the region. What have the results of those assessments have been? What has that money been spent on? Indeed, has all of it been spent? And is it the view that the £1 million payment is sufficient? I want to compare, of course, France announced in December that it was taking its total contribution to emergency appeals to €27.5 million. The EU's provided €17.5 million euros in humanitarian aid to assist those displaced in Armenia, and the United States announced an additional $4.1 million in November of 2023. And so I hope the Minister can provide some clarity on the sufficiency and the assessments that have been made in relation to our support. An important issue was raised around the protection of the cultural and religious heritage, not only, of course, in Nagorno-Karabakh, but more broadly. And I wonder if the Minister can say what assessments he has made of this, what discussions he's had with the Azeri authorities, and indeed with UNESCO and other bodies. This is of critical importance. And reference has been made to Armenia's critical role, particularly in the history of Christianity. And Nagorno-Karabakh and the wider region may seem remote to many, but I'm afraid to say that it contains men and women and children who've been successively let down for years, and they need and deserve our focus and support. I wonder if the Minister could say a little as well about the issue that's been raised relating to alleged extrajudicial killings, torture and abuse of prisoners of war, and what assessment has he made of individuals who are still held in prisons? Has he discussed this with his counterparts in Azerbaijan and elsewhere? I wonder if the Minister could set out a wider strategy for the Caucasus, spanning diplomacy, aid and trade, but also, crucially, atrocity prevention, humanitarian support and the upholding of human rights. And what assessment has he made of the role of UK corporations in the region? I think that's a very, very important point. We have a significant presence, and with that comes particular responsibilities in relation to ethical practices. We're also clear, and I think there would be unity in the House on this matter, that Russia should have no place in the region's future and would actively and is actively seeking to impede progress towards peace, security and good governance. The last few years have demonstrated that Putin's vision for the region is one that is less secure, less cohesive and weakens, so it remains within its sphere of influence. So what assessment has he made of Russia's engagement in the region, and what steps are being taken in concert with our partners to counter Russia's malign influence? And I draw note, Madam Chair, that Armenia has frozen its membership of the CSTO and is apparently considering leaving. What is the UK government's view on this, and how can we support all countries in the region and indeed across Europe who are seeking to extricate themselves from that malign influence that Russia provides? Finally, Madam Chair, can the Minister be clear on his position on the question of a right to return for ethnic Armenians removed from Nagorno-Karabakh, and what is the official UK government position on this issue? I referred earlier to the ICJ provisional judgment, and I hope he can provide a clear answer on this. Madam Chair, in conclusion, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh cannot be forgotten. This is a human face, a huge human face to tragedy. The impact on individual lives that I know many members here have heard directly has been immense. And I hope that the government will continue to support those people in their plight, as well as working to bring about a lasting and enduring peace in such a troubled region. The UK has a critical role to play in the Caucasus. Indeed, that's the view of the official opposition of the Labour Party, and I hope the government can demonstrate that they are ready to meet those challenges.
I call the Minister Leo Doherty. We're now back on track on time. Thank goodness. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ms. Elliott. I'm very pleased to be here answering in this important debate. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Glasgow North for securing this debate and highlighting, in reference to her recent experience of travelling in the region, the acute challenges facing those affected by September's military action in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I appreciate her sharing her impressions of her time there, and I'm very grateful for the contributions of all members, and I shall seek to cover off the questions and points raised during this afternoon's set of powerful and compelling speeches. And I will begin by reflecting on the humanitarian situation before turning to the topic of peace efforts, and because I think, as colleagues have concluded this afternoon, it's lasting peace which is at the heart of any long-term solution and any improvement in the lives and livelihoods of people in the region. So, as members have very eloquently set out, relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan are deeply complex. The plight of refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh is the most recent chapter in a 35-year conflict in which hundreds of thousands of civilians on both sides have been displaced from their homes. As we have heard this afternoon, last September, Azerbaijan carried out a military operation that restored their sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh. As a result, nearly the entire ethnic Armenian population of around 100,000 people fled to Armenia, where they faced acute humanitarian challenges. Now, while the UK fully recognises Azerbaijan's sovereignty and territorial integrity, of course, we're also clear that the use of force is not an acceptable means of resolving tensions between communities. As we have heard this afternoon, this military operation followed a 9-month restriction of the Lachin corridor, the only road linking Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia, which resulted in a dire humanitarian situation, including shortages of food, fuel, medicine and other basic supplies. And the UK made very clear bilaterally, as well as in the OSCE and at the United Nations, that the restriction of access to the Lachin corridor and other supply routes was unacceptable, and we publicly called for access to be restored. Just dwelling on UK action in terms of the humanitarian response, of course, we continue to work alongside international partners in both countries to support the humanitarian response to the situation. Last September, as has been discussed this afternoon, we announced £1 million for the Red Cross movement for life-saving medication, healthcare and other essential support for most vulnerable people affected by the conflict. And I have heard the calls this afternoon for an increased financial contribution, and I can say that, of course, we will continue to keep those issues under review. We should also bear in mind that we have contributed £1 million to regional demining since 2021. But I have noted the views of colleagues this afternoon, and we will keep that issue under review. We also provided further medical assistance to survivors in Armenia in partnership with UK Med, including medical supplies to the National Centre for Burns and Dermatology. We are committed to supporting Armenia as it provides for the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh, and we will continue to work with international partners and the Armenian government to strengthen its capacity to support the refugees and the communities hosting them. We're also determined to support Azerbaijan to make safe its recovered territories for the return of its own displaced population, as well as ensuring the integration of ethnic Armenians who wish to return. As I've mentioned, we have contributed £1.5 million to mine action in the region, which continues to have a very important life-saving effect. Just turning now to the peace process, and I intend during my peroration to answer all of the questions posed. It's clear that the peoples of both Armenia and Azerbaijan have suffered greatly during this long-running conflict. And that's why the UK government has been a leading voice in urging peace and engaging extensively with both governments. And I thought the Right Honourable Member for Malton summed up the current feeling when he described the fact that there is a realistic recognition of the current situation and a quiet positivity about the possibility of peace. And I concur with that sentiment. The UK stands by to be a partner for peace, and we will continue in our role to energetically engage diplomatically, to continue to offer our ability to convene and encourage. And in a nutshell, our role is to try and enable success for those two countries to come together and settle and conclude a lasting peace. Delighted.
giving way. Would he be able to address the issue, my honourable friend from the front bench raised it, of Russian influence? The fact that we hear the term Russian peacekeepers, is that not a contradiction in terms? And should they not be international border forces?
The honourable lady is absolutely right. It is a contradiction in terms to refer to Russian peacekeepers. They're nothing of the sort. We see the Russian role across the region as nothing but extremely unhelpful meddling, and I think there is therefore, and I'll maybe dwell on this at the end of my remarks, but and in answer to the honourable gentleman's question about our approach and in the context of the historic Russian role in the region, it's clear that in practical experience, Russia has been revealed to be an unhelpful and unreliable ally, and I'm very pleased that it means that, and I'm saying this conscious of His Excellency, the Ambassador, is in the public gallery, and I'm very glad to see His Excellency there. It's clearly incumbent upon countries like us to offer a hand of friendship and partnership to Armenia. And I'm very pleased that during my last visit there, we undertook the first stage of the strategic dialogue that now exists between our two countries, which represents a thickening and deepening of an increasingly meaningful bilateral relationship, which is good for both sides and good for the region. So just moving back to the peace process, if I may, in calls with the foreign ministers in both Armenia and Azerbaijan last September, I urged both sides to return to dialogue and ensure unfettered humanitarian access to vulnerable people and communities faced after events affected by events in Nagorno-Karabakh. The then Foreign Secretary reiterated this message last October when he spoke with various foreign ministers. As I've mentioned, I visited Yerevan and Baku last November, where I met with the leaders and the foreign ministers in both countries, and I urged them to engage meaningfully in internationally mediated negotiations to reach an agreement and to secure a lasting peace for the region. I was very delighted that President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan met in Munich last month at the Security Conference, and that their foreign ministers quickly followed up with a meeting in Berlin at the end of February, and we continue to engage energetically on the diplomatic front in terms of our own diplomacy. I'm encouraged by both sides' openness to continuing their discussions and to recognising and welcoming the offers of international support. We and the international community, in concert with allies in Europe and across the Atlantic, continue to stand ready to support them at every step of their journey towards peace. And I think I will refer again to the comments made by the honourable member for Malden. It's that realistic recognition of the opportunity now that lies ahead of both leaders for a meaningful and sustainable peace that is something we should be quietly optimistic about, and we will continue to offer our support through our diplomacy as they do that important work in the bilateral context, and that is something we should be quietly encouraged by. Delighted.
The UK will be hosting the European Political Community Summit. Does he see that as another key opportunity where the UK could play a role in trying to find efforts towards peace?
He's absolutely right. We are pleased that we will be hosting the EPC in July, and he's correct, and we note that that's a very useful convening moment and a good opportunity for leaders from the Caucasus to come together in concert with other European leaders to progress peace. And if I can just turn to some of the additional questions posed. Firstly, on the preservation of religious sites. Of course, both Armenia and Azerbaijan are responsible for ensuring that the cultural heritage of all the peoples of the region is protected and preserved for the benefit of all. We take very seriously reports of the destruction of religious and cultural sites, and we support the work of international organisations, observation missions in evaluating this. And I was also grateful, I should say, for the Honourable Member for Strangford raising the important issue of freedom of religion, and I entirely agree with the sentiment expressed therein. Several members posed questions about prisoners of war and war crimes. On the issue of prisoners of war, of course, we continue to encourage the return of all prisoners of war and the remains of the deceased from the conflicts. and we were pleased to see Armenia and Azerbaijan agree to the release of 34 prisoners in December last year, and we continue to call for... Oh, God, yes. Yes, okay.
Convention to leave
yes.
a moment or two for wind-ups
Delighted,
from
yes.
the moving member.
So to conclude, and I should just say, can I just... I will conclude, therefore. Let me reiterate that we stand by those affected by this conflict. We will continue to offer humanitarian support. We will continue to very energetically offer our diplomatic support. And we hope that this is a moment, after many turbulent years, that there is a real and meaningful and sustainable chance of peace in the South Caucasus.
Thank you. Carol Monaghan.
First of all, I want to conclude my remarks by paying tribute to the government and people of Armenia who have ensured that the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh have been given the food, shelter and support that they require. I want to thank all of those who have joined us this afternoon in the public gallery, including His Excellency the Ambassador. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. And finally, can I thank all the members here this afternoon who have participated in this really important debate. It is important that we shine a light on the troubled area of Nagorno-Karabakh and ensure that the people of Nagorno-Karabakh currently in Armenia are not forgotten.
Yeah, well done.
Order, order. That this House has considered international support for the Armenian refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Do we have a minister? Right. Sorry. Thanks, Carl. Yeah, we'll have to give it a moment to clear. The minister needs to come and sit down.
Sorry.
Shall I start them to speak? The minister, what is he doing? I will call Tim